Hey, and welcome to the Rabbit Trail Podcast. This is episode number 108.
108 is back.
108.
I messed up.
Oh.
We should start over.
I messed you up.
You said 108?
Yeah.
I said 108.
What?
108.
There we go.
My wife said we need to drop this joke.
I was
she
out
said
of
it's
practice.
over. So
She's done with the math assignment.
yeah.
You know, my dad told me that when I was growing up, and he taught me, to be funny. And he's like, a joke is funny once. It might be cute the second time. After that, let it go. So your wife is well educated in the art of humor.
All right.
And so, Teresa, we want to give it to you. You are amazing, and you are bold to state that through Greg. Obviously, you weren't bold enough to tell it to us to our face or even to bring it up on the podcast and make it a debate.
I don't know. She might have. We probably just ignored it and then moved on. And like I'm doing right now. But we are glad that you're joining us. If this is your first time, welcome. This is indeed a rabbit trail where we're gonna chase the truth wherever it leads. And what we mean by that is we bring up subjects at Olive Branch Community Church, which is the sponsor of the podcast, and from the sermons, whether I preach them or one of us preaches them or somebody else, we try to dig in deeper. Things that may have not gotten into the sermon, we bring them up, or maybe we have some questions that want to take us further, or maybe you have some questions that want to take you further and you want to ask us. We would love to go into that. We're just glad you're joining us, and you saw Brent. Now, let me introduce my other co-host, Stephen.
Hello, I'm Stephen Oldham, the local outreach coordinator, and let us know where you're listening to us. If you're listening to us on YouTube, go ahead and click the bell. If you want to be notified, click a thumbs up if you liked it. Yeah, and please subscribe so that we get our numbers up and then more people can hear about us and interact with us, and we can have great conversations.
And we would love to discuss your questions, so feel free to send them to us at rabbittrail@obcc.church, rabbittrail@obcc.church. My name is Brent. I'm the Connections Pastor here at Olive Branch, and it's good to be back after a nice, relaxing vacation. And
Yeah, you went to, again.
We went to Cabo.
What episode was it that you came back from Cabo last time?
I don't know. But
there is one.
Episode?
it was a year ago. I've been to Cabo the last 3 birthdays in a row. So,
Yeah. You're not letting us celebrate with you at all.
I know.
How old are you now?
I am 62 years old.
Yeah, you should have figured it out by now that we want to celebrate with you. But, happy birthday, Brent.
Thank you.
It's my son's 18th birthday yesterday. I'm officially the father of 2 adults and 2 kids. My daughter pointed out, hey, the adults outnumber the kids in this house now. And I was like,
Ooh.
I don't know if that counts, but whatever. It's fun.
That is great.
You had a birthday, your son had a birthday, and my mother had a birthday on Sunday.
It is
It's a
awesome.
birthday time.
When I was gone, I forgot who it was, but I remember seeing one of my friends on Facebook. They had a grandchild that was born on my birthday too. So my birthday month is pretty popular.
Your birthday month?
Yeah.
You're one of those?
In fact, you guys didn't carry it on last week, but this still is February, so it's still crappy Christian joke February. So who was the most foul-mouthed person in the Bible?
The most foul-mouthed. The rooster who crowed.
That was what I thought when I heard that, too.
Yeah, okay.
I thought the rooster. But no, the most foul-mouthed person in the Bible was Job, because he began cursing the day he was born. You get it?
Ba-dum-bum.
Cursing the day he was born. That is funny right there. I don't care who you are.
Well, you imagine his mom's face. What did he just say?
And for those of you that don't know, it's not that he cussed the day he was born. It was when he was going through his suffering, he began cursing the day he was born. Wow, that is so deep and rich. Just dripping with something.
Yep. It's definitely driven with something. All right. So this week we were diving into all kinds of conversations, somewhat political, really talking about the idea in this series that we're talking about contrast, living in a time where people are kind of pushing against the church. How do you live so that people lean in? And, first week we landed on the idea of good works and the idea that you should be living those out. And this week we're talking about, how do you do that in a political culture? How do you do that in a world in their world filled with emperors and our world filled with presidents and politicians and radio and all that fun stuff. But so we were just kind of looking at that and looking at some various conversations from that. And so I don't know, what stood out? What questions did you guys run into? What were you thinking?
Well, I think a couple of things that we can touch on. One, you had brought up, and I think it was probably your first point too, that we need to live as people that are freed by God. Right?
Yeah.
So I think it'd be kind of cool to discuss really what is freedom, what does freedom look like, true freedom, biblical freedom too, and the fact that it probably, you brought it up in the sermon, is probably not what a lot of people think freedom is, meaning I can just do whatever I want, and if I can do whatever I want when I feel like doing it, that is true freedom, and that is not biblical freedom. We can talk about that. You brought up Christian nationalism. There's a movement out there. It's got a bad name. Is it good or is it bad? What is it? So we can talk about that. And also, when it comes to being a good citizen and voting and stuff like that, and fulfilling our civic duty as citizens and Christians, when it comes to some of the more difficult, controversial issues, how do we vote as Christians and as citizens, and are they ever in conflict with one another? So I think those are some of the things we can talk about. But first, talking about freedom. What is freedom? How would you define freedom from a biblical standpoint?
Well, the way I defined it for our congregation was the idea that freedom is freedom from sin. So you're set free from the guilt and the shame and the punishment. So freedom from condemnation, and then freedom from death. And so the idea is, there's a great series of podcasts out there that the Bible Project did on the dragon in the Bible. Mm-hmm. And when you get near the end of it, they start really kind of showing off the characterization of that the dragon is really the chaos, destruction, it's death itself kind of a thing, and that the demonic, like Satan, uses this power, uses sin, uses death, uses these deordering constructs to destroy people and separate them from God. And it's just kind of a fascinating thing. So when you step back and think about that, one of the fascinating pieces is that in the Bible, like in Ephesians, for example, and he's going to tell you to put on the armor of God, right? A lot of people love this stuff because it's kind of getting close to spiritual warfare. It is spiritual warfare language. But many scholars tried for many, many decades to just say, no, that has nothing to do with the spiritual beings. These are all names of basically government positions, archons, and these kinds of things. And they are, and that's on purpose. The Bible weds the spiritual powers on earth, the fallen ones, and government together in a lot of ways, which is fascinating to me. So, and they do that because the government wields, now I believe under God's right and will, they wield the sword and they wield temptation, right? They can tempt you by telling you, I'm going to give you stuff. I'm going to, pay for your food, pay for your this, they're like, I'm going to give you what you need. I'm going to be your, actually funny thing is that it's called, I forgot what it is. It's basically like the idea that the government's like a father. Paternalism is the idea, and it was actually started by William Wilberforce. He was like a big movement for helping the poor and using the government as a means to do that. He was one of the first guys to really push this concept of paternalism that has erupted in our culture and other cultures in England and Europe as like, well, the government is going to take care of us. And so at the same time, the government can punish you, right? They can take the sword and whack you. And so, but if you're free from death and God's promised you everything, and you're free from condemnation, and you're not going to hell, that has a political freedom suddenly about it. And this is the part that I just enjoy. I don't think people see that attachment. I don't know if you guys have thought through that before, the construct of the sword being removed and the temptation gone, that the government can't tempt or harm you anymore. You're free because of Christ. You're under his kingdom now.
Yeah. I mean, there's a lot there.
Yeah.
With freedom, to me, it's like even when it comes to like philosophically how some people define freedom, the one that makes most sense is the one that does correlate with that. For us, as a Christian, there's an aspect of freedom that has to do with your spiritual state before God, right? That if you are bound by something that you're not designed to follow, then you are kind of not free in that sense, right? And so in that idea is that if you're free before God, then you are truly free, regardless of what else is going on.
No matter how you get bound by anything else.
Because ultimately there's a judge that will make all things right in the end. And so even if it's temporarily bound in some way, it will be redeemed in the end by an ultimate judge. And so in that sense, there's ultimate freedom if you're in the right standing before God. But also how this plays out with some ideas, even when people aren't Christian, is that the definition that some people often use is freedom is the ability to pursue that which is good. And so the idea is, what is the ultimate good? Well, the ultimate good would be to be free before your Creator, free to pursue what He's created you to be. But even if you don't think on that level, if you don't think that freedom is defined as the pursuit of doing that which is good, and it's doing whatever you want, then you're going to have a lot more conflict. And so when they were forming our Constitution, when they were forming different things, this debate was coming up. What is it good? What is freedom? And it's the pursuit to do that which is good. Now that came into writing as happiness. And then you have the definition of happiness that we don't share today, that they didn't share, that they had a different one. And what happiness was in that philosophical worldview is that happiness is when you look back at all the good that you've done in your life, then and only then at the end of your life can you say that you've pursued happiness. Now we think of happiness as this temporary emotional state where no one restricts the boundaries of your feelings. And that really is more of a...
I feel good. It makes me happy. It makes me laugh.
Yeah. You throw off the shackles of anything that impedes your personal feelings, right? This is more of a French belief that was going around early in the Reign of Terror was a good fruitful aspect of how that came about. But you see these things are tied together in the sense that if freedom is truly about pursuing that which is good, the ultimate question to ask is, well, what is good? And what is it good for men to do? And this is where we debate in politics in a country. But if you don't believe that anything is good but what I think it is, then we're already back to the Reign of Terror. Everybody's throwing off shackles and fighting each other. And so that's really, that lies with Christianity as well, because now we're talking about what is spiritually good for us is to serve God and be free as He defines us to be, not to pursue any other kind of bondage that would be counter to that. But also just in general, if you don't believe in God at all, asking yourself, is it freedom really to do whatever I want, or is it to do that which is good for me to do?
And I think that people do lose that mentality, that the freedom to do good. And a lot of people feel like, no, freedom means I have the freedom to do good or to do bad. And you don't, And not even from a biblical standpoint is freedom in that regard, right? Mm-hmm. Because freedom isn't people doing whatever they want. The Bible even says that we were set free, basically, to become bondservants, or servants of Christ. So we were freed to be a slave, in a sense. And also that whole idea of, grace abounds to cover our shame and our shortcomings. Grace abounds when we sin. So should we continue sinning that grace can keep, abounding? And it's like, by all means, no, you're not. You are restricted from that, and I know I wrote down
restricted if you believe that you want to do what's good.
Yeah.
Again, I still feel like God gives us, and this may be a different debate, but God gives us the choice to choose good or not. He doesn't take that away in some senses. He allows you to make your choices. But the choice that you have, if it's not good, will lead to bondage in and of a sense. So the thing is what do you want to serve? And service comes up a lot because I think everybody, whether they like to admit it or not, is serving something.
Right.
And so the idea that I'm serving my own will, which is usually not your own will, it's usually borrowed from society or some other thing that you heard that you thought that's a good thing to do, and so you pursued that. But it's not always just internally coming from yourself. And in that, you are captured to that idea or that philosophy or however much people will allow you to pursue that philosophy. So you're not really free, but you're free to pursue it.
Yeah, and we've been prohibited from using our freedom for evil.
As a Christian,
right?
if you really believe that, if God is good.
And I believe His Spirit convicts you to not do that. I think that the difference is that you can, while you may do good and build that muscle to do good, you can sin, but it's always going against the grain. The Spirit of God is there telling you that's sin. And I think that's one of those pieces we've talked about where it's like, when you really have come to know when you've really come to know Christ, one of the biggest evidences of that is that sudden presence of the Spirit of God who's in you going, that's wrong. And it wasn't wrong like last week. Now it's wrong. Like what in the world's going on inside of me? And so, I think I agree. In both those cases, you may have the freedom to continue to do things you used to do. And many people choose that, but you're going to deaden the Spirit speaking. There's potential. Scripture gives us the potential that people stumble and walk away. Like they don't continue, either they were never saved or didn't continue in it. However you want to structure the speculation on that and theology, that's different. But what I really find interesting is this idea of freedom being primarily from God and not being from a government. It's not coming from...
Where does it come from?
It's not coming from fellow humans. Because if you're ultimately freed by God, like I said, there's nothing, like people can do all kinds of things to you, but they can never take away the promise that God's given to you. They can never take away. And this is how seriously we believe in this faith. This is why, honestly, China doesn't like Christianity preached in its purest form. That's why they control the Tri-Self Church and things like that in Chinese, and communists don't like it because it tells people they're free. They're not under the auspices of a tyrant. They don't have to. They can't control this people because they will live freely, and you can't do anything to them. So that's really kind of the big freedom piece to me. Plus, we live in a culture that really wants to be free from everything, and yet we forget you're bound. You no matter how much you want to be free, the only thing you're never going to get free from is yourself. Like, you can't stop being you. You always will be you, even if you're like, well, I'm not going to be me. I'm going to be somebody else. That's you saying you're going to be somebody else. There's an identity at the core of who you are that can never be escaped, and that's been given to you because there was a point where you didn't exist, and now you do. And if that identity's been given to you, it doesn't matter how you choose to show off what you think it is, you're never going to escape that. The you is something that you didn't get to choose.
And I think, too, if you choose not to do good, right, that's not freedom, really, in the sense of this. We are created in the image of God. God is a community in himself, the triune God. So we are created in and we are created for community as well. So I think we, as people, kind of like to look at ourselves as individuals, and what I do is about me. So freedom for me means I can do whatever I want. But if everybody did whatever they wanted, you would be infringing on other people's freedoms, right? So if everybody was truly free to do whatever they wanted, even bad things, you would infringe on my freedom, and therefore I would not be free anymore. And so within the confines of that anarchy. Community, within that confines of community, then that's where real freedom operates. Right?
David Wells makes this argument that as morality drops in a culture, you have to go to the one with the gun to get your neighbors to obey.
Yeah.
And this is why you have suddenly we didn't have a lot of laws when we started in the United States. Like, there wasn't tons of federal laws and things like this. We create those laws when people break the laws. They do this. They talk about this in leadership. The idea is that you can have a very simple, business at the beginning. And then what happens is, as people make mistakes, you make more policies.
Right.
And more policies means slower.
It's called the Old Testament.
Right. You don't change. Exactly.
It's that whole adage of, in the garden when everything was in its rightful place, there was one law. Right. Then when man fell, they made 10 laws. And then from those 10 laws, they made hundreds and hundreds of laws.
And the bottom line is that we didn't like it when there was one. So there's always a law. Life is filled with laws, whether it be them the laws of physics, be them the laws of just reality. And it's a world of confines. And so that's why I think that second freedom, not the freedom from, but the freedom to, is so critical. That The vision, like you were talking about, of happiness, the vision of the pagan mind in the ancient world was to live within the reasonable laws that they could figure out. But they were very sinister laws. I mean, I hate to say it, but Nicomachean Ethics is not the most ethical book on the planet when you start really reading him.
Well, again,
he starts dividing humanity into slaves by nature, and you need to treat children in this way. And we would be horrified as a Western society today because we have been so fused with Christian morals and ethics.
That's what I'm saying. Like, typically they're on the right track, but with the wrong God or the wrong philosophy, the wrong idea of how
the wrong revelation is really what it is.
And so what you end up having is something that's on the right track but abusive. And people say this of like Hammurabi as opposed to when you read the Old Testament laws. There's a difference there between what gods you're serving and who is human. Because the very idea that everyone's created in the image of God is not how Hammurabi looked at human beings. He looked at them as different kinds of people.
He looked at him as the image of God. Yeah, nobody else was.
No one else was. But even slaves weren't really fully people in his mindset and the mindsets. That concept is one that comes from Christianity and Judeo-Christian idea that God created everyone in his image, and that was a very unique idea to that God. And so so you can have the idea that we need laws to make sure we don't hurt each other, or we are productive and that we do good things. But then if you think good is bad, then yeah, you're going to have problems. And so to me, you never escape. Even a good philosophy can never escape the sin nature problem. And there's always a spiritual component to lawmaking that no one can avoid, and everyone is invoking some kind of version of spirituality, whether they think so or not, because they're saying what is good for man to be and do to each other and on the earth. And as soon as you do that, those are some of the realms of religion, and some of those concepts come from religion. You try to do it separate from that, and you have a very cold, maybe science, but how many people will have to die before you figure out whether a law is useful?
How much evil do you have to commit until finally a good is discovered? So is that evil?
Yeah, and productive societies, even secular, I shouldn't say secular, because you go in the ancient world, there's no such thing really. But even those societies that were productive had somewhat similar concepts to biblical concepts, you know what I mean? And they passed each other's thoughts around. So they were in conversation with each other about how to govern. What I really don't like is that because we think they're all stupid and we're all smart, we don't actually understand that a lot of our concepts that are solid in our country, or in many good countries or countries that have good in them, it comes from people building on looking at how people thought what was good to do. And so somehow when you abandon that and think everyone in the world that was before us is dumb, then you do separate yourself from the knowledge that they have as well. But I do think they never have this problem. In the ancient world, they were always having philosophy, theology, conversations, and governance together. It isn't until the modern world that we're trying to separate those things out. And we think that the separation means that you can't have those thoughts at all, and they don't have anything.
Or they don't integrate.
We like
to chop things into pieces.
Or that if you inherit one, you disavow the rights of someone who doesn't believe in God.
So here's what's weird, because political science, right, in that sense, the way that you described it, when we take on the evolutionary ethic, it really is. Let's look back at all of humanity's failures and all the evils that they did. Oh, look, we found a good. Like, we had to do all this evil to find a good thing. And let's put all those goods together. And when you stop, I really believe that if you were to stop and just read the scriptures and go through the ethics that are found within the scripture, and I'm not, I understand that there are some pretty controversial laws in the Old Testament.
So there's still human beings there.
And that there are some restrictions, and they have a very clear context, and they weren't lived out perfectly, and I get all that stuff.
And there were accommodations made for their sinful condition.
Right, and when you look at the ethic, though, of the ideas that Jesus lays out, in Genesis, these are some of the grandest. It's the grandest ethic that's ever existed. You can't find a better one that calls all of human beings to the equal plane, and yet we're all messed up at the same place, and yet all have the same answer. It is a very inclusive, hyper inclusive message.
Yeah, the idea of human rights is one that comes from the idea that we're all created in the image of God. When you look back at history, you don't really see that idea as fleshed out at all as you do in Christianity.
The more they've researched it, they're like, this is a wholly Judeo-Christian ethic.
So if you don't pin your human rights on something greater than your own ability, just your own opinion, then you have a problem, because human rights falls apart. Because if we are all not equal, we're all evolved differently and we're different species and we can't even communicate, then it's okay to fight like animals do in the animal kingdom. And so if you can't pin it on a higher idea that we're all created equal, then you have a real philosophical problem, regardless of the religious implications. So to me, it's like you got to be careful. The idea that you think there is a thing called human rights, you need to realize historically that comes from the idea that the concepts from Christianity.
Okay, so again, from a political view, and you brought up Christian nationalism, right? And we'll get into what that is in just a minute. But we understand too that although America was founded with Judeo-Christian values, started out kind of as a God-fearing nation. It was never a theocracy.
It's better to say it as it was born out of Europe, which was a Judeo-Christian culture.
Okay.
But because included in that is also the Enlightenment and the Reformation and Catholicism and Judaism and Roman and Greek background. So this is a massive amalgam of European tradition is what formed America. And so a lot of the ethics and things, yes, they would have said they were moral and religious.
They would have had a healthy respect for the philosophical underpinnings of religious texts,
and especially Christianity. But they would never have said it was a Christian, like specifically Christian, because that was actually one of the things that was difficult about England was a specifically Christian nation, and
the Anglican Church,
and most of America was religious refugees. We were
from
the Anglican Church. We were fleeing over here to get freedom, to worship God as we wanted, and to proclaim the gospel as we wanted. And that's where freedom of speech came from. It was the
freedom of religion.
Yeah, freedom of religion, which are in the same clause. They're the same clause in the. They're the first freedoms, and the reason they're the same clause in the United States is because the belief that if I hinder your voice, then you can hinder mine, right? So if I used to tell students in youth ministry for years, like, don't go telling somebody that is not a Christian they can't cuss around you. Like, that's because then you're giving them every right to tell you, well, then don't talk about Jesus around me. And my point is, like, we do not want to create any kind of situation in which the gospel gets muzzled because we think that we need to control something. That's a very dangerous precedent to set.
Well, it has to go back to the idea that the best means by which Christians change, to me, culture is through persuasion and participation than coercion and strict rules without any kind of explanation. So even when it comes to rulemaking, I think you have to be an advocate for this being the good of the nation and try to persuade people why it is good to do these things, and good for not just me, but good for everyone. And that means having outcomes, and that means discussing these things and trying.
It means freedom for research. It means freedom for and being able to call out bias and being able to call out, hey, you're restricting. As we're finding in all kinds of places. I was just reading another article about how many in the last 20 years peer-reviewed articles are being thrown out because the peer reviewers were biased and allowing things in they liked but weren't checking out the research.
Their data doesn't actually meet their conclusions because they're not connected in any way.
And there's a lot of thoughts out there that are based on those kinds of studies. But when we look at this concept of what, Christian nationalism, you were kind of asking.
Like theocratic governments, right? What are the pros and cons of having a theocracy? I mean, if we're all Christians and we wanted to form a Christian nation, is a theocratic government, does that have a negative connotation or totally positive?
I believe it has a negative connotation.
Yeah, I mean, even historically, you're talking about theocracies. To me, the biggest problem that church did is we had our biggest change in the way people thought when we were more prophetic in our voice about what governance is doing than it is when we try to take it over and make everyone think like the church. Once you put those two together, it takes away an aspect of us being able to persuade people towards the gospel. The one thing I love about Christianity is it is one of the true faiths that hadn't relied in its foundation on coercion and war to get people to do it when it comes to Christianity. So, like, to me, it's like we talk to people about Christ. And oftentimes so much so that everyone in America thinks every religion does that to persuade people into the religion.
Nope.
That's not typically true. Typically what you do is you pervade government, you put your people around, and then you just declare the nation as whatever particular religious group you are. And this has happened. This has happened historically, even in countries like the East, when you have like Hindu governments fighting over Buddhist governments. Whoever wins is who declares whose religion it is. And so that's the thing I think that I'm worried about getting back to, is this idea that a big part of even being a Christian is persuasion.
So do a thought experiment. This is why I think theocracy is not in the realm of that it's not equivalent to the kingdom of God on earth. And the reason I say that is, imagine you had a nation. We have an island, and on that island is only Christians, and we're all living as Christians. And so we go, we're going to have a theocracy. We're going to take every law that God put out, and we're going to put it there. In fact, the law number 1, you can worship no other gods but the Christian God. Well, first and foremost, I think we made a fundamental flaw in that law. While that is the true of the moral law, the moral ethic, the ultimate moral law is you should know and worship your creator and not make up a fake God. However, the problem is that our faith is not based upon, like we said, coercion. It's based upon willingly giving my life to the Lord and wanting to, and receiving his gospel. It's being transformed by a gospel. So all it takes is one generation later, and you have little non-Christians running around who are being coerced into the gospel because they have to obey this. If they don't, they're going to get jail time or they're going to be kicked off the island. That now you've actually killed the gospel just with that simple theocratic call. And that's why I think that people are silly to think that we need to be a theocracy, or thinking that Christians want a theocracy, because that is the fastest way to destroy the ability to present a gospel that is able to be truly and wholeheartedly received without coercion. And so I think that it just right out the gate doesn't work.
Okay, so looking at Israel back in the day, right? God was their king. Were they a theocracy at that point? And then also if you blasphemed this God, then you would be stoned to death. You would be put to death. And so there was an element of coercion going there, but there was this cultural aspect too. What is the difference between that and a theocracy?
That was a true theocracy.
Okay.
Yeah, and I think that the people, the problem is that in those cases, yes, they were called to follow him, and they were called to and you'll read it. That's not like, it's funny because you can find people who weren't believing in Yahweh living amongst them. Mm-hmm. They weren't stoned to death for those reasons. You're stoned to death for trying to lead someone away from Yahweh or try to falsely proclaim a different God. There are particular sins that you did. And I could be getting that wrong. I don't remember a specific one. You can if you blasphemed the Lord, yes, you would be stoned to death. If you broke the Sabbath, you'd be. So there's a lot of religious rules around it, obviously. And so that is a theocracy. As a God, he's the king. And so when you have God as the king, yeah, you don't blaspheme the king.
So I guess the question would be, why was it part of the Old Testament, not part of the New?
Well, yeah, and the answer there is the New Testament church is not a singular nation.
Yeah.
It is a gathering of the nations under the kingdom of God, which is an eternal kingdom in the heavens. I live under a theocracy. Don't get me wrong, but it's not an earthly one. Like I will stand before my king. I will stand before Jesus, and I will have to face the fact that I have been his subject and I have not upheld all his laws, and rules that he has called me to, and loving my neighbor as myself, and these kinds of things. And I'm doing my best to learn how to live under that reign and rule. And I ask for it, your kingdom come, your will be done. That's what we're praying for. But do I think that should enter in the sense of like, hey, we're going to make the first, 4 rules of the Bible of, you shall have no other gods before you, that those are going to be, those are the necessary starting points for Christians to be arguing for. I don't really know. I mean, that's the right route to go. So
yeah, the reason why I said Christianity is because I do feel like God takes people from where they are to the most ideal of where he wants them to be. The more he spends time with them, there was no such thing as a non-theocracy in the ancient world. Right. Every culture had a religion, and so how do you spread the ideas of who God is to the nations in that world, and that's what God is using when he's talking to them. He's building a nation to bring people in from the nation so they can all get along under him. But it's not through and so as they get closer and closer, the ultimate ideal was that freedom to come to him was always something that he wanted them to do. Even back in the garden, he wanted them to come to him. He's like, where are you? And even when they're sinning, he's wanting them to come to him. And so the idea is that God does work with the flaws and failed ways in which we are caught in our sins, and then he uses that to teach us as generations go on to the ideal. And when you have Christ is like, under any government, that's one thing, but what my kingdom isn't of this world. And I know that that's what you like and how everyone's involved in this world, but I'm telling you, the church will be formed on this other kingdom, and you can live in any world, any government, and do my will. And so you're free in some sense from all government tyranny, but in another sense, you have to contend with it as a Christian. And so that's a huge shift, and it's a big part of that is persuading people towards God's truth, regardless of the outcomes. And that's why suffering became such a great means to show that you were sincere, because you're trying to convince people, like, I believe this so much, I'm willing to die for what I believe. And out of this, you have a lot of injustice being shown to people, and you have civil rights, and you have other things that people have done to say, like, I'm willing to die for what I believe God is telling me to do. And in that, you see what God is talking about, that this isn't the only world that we need to be focused on obeying. So,
and then, theocracy versus Christian nationalism, right? You hear that term. It's used derogatorily at times. So again, what exactly is Christian nationalism? And is it an attempt to bring a form of theocracy into a secular government system? Or what would you say it is?
Stephen, you kind of looked that up. So
Christian nationalism is hard to define because you have so many different people trying to define it for their own advantageous reasons. When it comes to nationalism, I mean, some people think nationalism just means liking your country. Well, I would say no. I would call that patriotism, right? Nationalism would probably be more along the lines of that just by the sheer nature of being born here, I'm better than all the other nations of the world, and therefore should propagate my own nation over every other nation, regardless of what's good. That would be the negative term. I imagine there's a positive definition of nationalism as well that people try to throw around. So I don't know. Were you going to say something?
No, it has far more to do with the affection towards your government, in my mind, than it does with the affection towards your nation. Like, we can have a nation of people. Like, we used to be a nation with a very, like, kind of weak federal government. There wasn't a centralized. In fact, they used to call it the United States of America, right? And the emphasis was on the United States of America. And now it's just we call ourselves America. That switch.
Or just America.
America. We aren't the United States anymore, and we are one country. And people used to think that their country was their state. They would literally call Virginia their country, and that this was almost like we would think of the EU, kind of like working together, right? And so I think what's happened is when you have a strong affection for your government and a paternalistic government desire, where you want the government to be that which defends you and protects you and gives you what you want. I think that fits that nationalist perspective, because from what I'm hearing is that this is Christian groups that want the government to be welded with a specific Christian kind of culture or nation or ethos, and they need to uphold and defend that instead of it being something that we are winning in a cultural conversation and the creation of goods and looking at the positive outcomes for the betterment of other human beings, and that's what we should make the law. That's what we should all do together. We agree that that's how we should be, kind of thing. Very, very, in my mind, that's what the Christian nationalists are trying to do. They're trying to use almost like the government power to bring about the Christian nation in that sense, right?
Yeah. I mean, to me, it's typically also a bias for what you want to see, and it can be kind of idolatrous in the sense that you think that the best means by which Christianity should be spread is through a government as opposed to what I would think would be the church. And so that to me is a form of idolatry, because the Lord has established a church for people to see him, but also to see him as more important and how we treat each other than it is about forming a nation. I don't know if God said, be fruitful and go out and form nations. I think he said you should multiply, tell people about me. Also, when you have the Great Commission, go therefore and preach the gospel
to all nations.
So to me, the idea that you would try to kind of short round in some sense around the gospel presentation being something that you share, that you have to convince to tell the story, that kind of is a cheat around to get the desired outcome over actually doing the work, which I think God calls us to do. So in so much as you just think of nationalism in a sense of, liking your country or thinking it's the best country because of some objective reasons, that to me more along the lines of patriotism, but some people would define that as being nationalistic. But if we go back and look at what nationalism, why it became negative, is in the World War I and II, you had all of these nations thinking they were the best nation. And they decided that they wanted to compete over why that was the case, because they wanted to prove it to each other. And so that led to fighting. And so the idea is when you give up persuasion over coercion again, I think you're abandoning the gospel in that sense. And so for me, it's kind of a form of idolatry, a Christian nationalism. And I don't think that our best resources as a church should be constantly just forming the nation. Now, they're not mutually exclusive ideas. I think one can pursue what is best for a group of people through persuasion and then vote their conscience. That's really what we're supposed to do as good citizens. But we should never give up what I consider our prophetic role as the church, which is telling people what is good, regardless of whether it's favorable to us, even in our own parties or whatever you are.
Follow me on this one, guys, because I'm not going to we're recording this and sending it out into the internet, but whatever. What I find fascinating in the way that we're describing and what we've looked up and found about Christian nationalism is that it actually sounds like critical theory in Christianity. There is this sense that we've become the victims, and what we need to do is use power to overcome the victimhood, and
we're losing something,
and tell everybody else off why they are no longer allowed to treat us like that. It's a systemic, horrible, anti-Christian viewpoint out there, and that if we are going to fight power, we're going to need power, and so get the power. And so I can see how A, that might be true, or B, how people who are steeped in critical theory are reading Christians. And so I think there's a very, very high chance that what's happening is that they are projecting their own viewpoint, their own worldview onto Christians. And so they're having a read of patriotic Christians as, well, if I was a Christian in my critical theory mind, this is how I would do it. And so that must be what they're doing.
Yeah.
Do I think there are Christians out there who think that way? Yes, I actually think that there are likely in this very critical theory world and mood that we're in which the victim over a systemic situation needs to rise up above them and have the power. That's exactly what this sounds like, is that we're going to use the government, we're going to gain the power, the wheels of power, and now it's all about power. And so again, we go back to, we don't need power. We have been given the power of the resurrection. We've been given a power that is beyond this world. Though you kill us, I'll be back. That whole concept. And what we need to remember is that we have persuasion on our side. And we have good on our side. And so we need to do the good and do persuasion. And the power is going to be always wielded in many ways evilly. In fact, over and over in Scripture, you think about who wielded the power between Cain and Abel. Well, Cain did, and Cain was the one who was ostracized, and he became the first nation in a sense, away from his family. When you get the whole Tower of Babel, and they're trying to become powerful and do it, God goes, spread you and makes nations. I mean, happens is it cracks us up when we deal with power. Power breaks people down, breaks things up. And so we don't want to go in that route, especially as Christians.
Well, Paul spent a fair amount of time in the marketplace of ideas trying to persuade people towards what he knew to be true, regardless of whether that put him in jail or not. And that is the best means by which to communicate. You go, I believe this is so true. I'm willing to suffer for it. And that shows through, I think, a lot for people. But that we should never, as a church, that's our strongest thing in history, has been that ability to never drop persuasion by making a law and forcing people into it. As soon as you have people being forced in, it usually does the opposite. Like when you've seen in the ancient world where they were like taking Jews and making them Christians or something like that, or persecuting them through the Inquisition and stuff. What you did is you made them even double down on never accepting Christianity.
For generations,
because you wanted to harm them into Christianity, and that has never been what Christ has called us to do with the Great Commission. So to me, never give up your ability to persuade. And I would say this to anyone, even if they're not Christian, you have to ask yourself, do you want to harm people into what you think is the ultimate good? And do you think that's the best means of communicating and having people stay under your thumb? That you're going to constantly have to watch everything they do because you put them there through force. They're not going to leave. They're going to leave the first moment they get. You're going to have to constantly monitor them if they disagree with you. And so you have to constantly find your enemies and root them out. But if you persuade that person, then you have agreement, and then they're there on your side. And so I always ask people, when we're arguing and we're having a political discussion, what's the goal? Is the goal that you want to persuade me to something you think is good, or do you want to punish me, or you want to shame me or hurt me or harm me? Because I don't think that's as effective as convincing me. And we have the freedom in our country to convince one another and have a conversation, exchange of ideas. I think the problem with both sides, in my opinion, is that we've abandoned the idea of persuasion over coercion. And we get angry and mad and frustrated and going, okay, let's calm down.
Which are power plays.
Yeah, you give up your best testimonies and your best influence when you abandon persuasion. Because it's saying, I don't have the truth. I have to fight for what I want because the truth isn't strong enough to persuade people. And you don't have to, you're not responsible ultimately for them accepting that truth, but you believe in it so much that you're willing to suffer the consequences when people are not being truthful towards you because you know that's the best outcome. So I often say that because I think if people really think that like wokeism or whatever their belief is or Christian nationalism is the best, why can't you persuade people? Why is there such like hiding and like trickery and all of these little things that people have to do to get people to win? And if you're winning by trickery, then you're going to have to win that way forever. Because as soon as someone finds out you've been lying to them and that you're not really honest with what you think, they're going to think, what else are you not honest with me for? And if Christians do this too, they're going to think, well, what else are you lying? Is God really the God who uses the Inquisition, or is he the God who died and loved people into the kingdom?
Which is why we're calling this series Contrast.
Yeah.
We want to stand out differently. So.
Yeah, and I mean, that whole idea of persuasion and dialogue, and you see it so much, especially in politics, which, on this topic, the topic was politics, is just we have become so polemic. And again, nobody defends or an argument. All they do is attack, right? So again, with one side talking
good defense
about
is a good offense, and the best offense is a good defense.
But one side, lambasting the candidate on the other side and saying disparaging things about them because they act a certain way or do a certain thing, and instead of going, yeah, you're right, or trying to defend that person's character, instead you just point to the other side and go, well, they did it, and it's like going to a mass murderer and going, that's wrong. Well, you know what? This guy killed 10 people more, so I'm not that bad. And it's like, no, it's bad. And so we don't really try to persuade one another. We don't try to defend the truth, even when the truth is not on our side, and we just want to argue and not get anywhere. And again, when it comes to politics and political issues, I don't see a lot of, I see that there's a lot of topics that are not black and white, so I do understand sometimes where they ask a politician a yes or no question and he gives you a 15-minute answer. Part of that is they don't really want to answer. What?
That's like us.
Yeah.
Exactly.
It's like a rabbit trail.
Right. Yeah, we give you 45 minutes. Yeah. But part of that is, a lot of times they don't want to answer the question and they don't want to get locked into a soundbite that they said it. But the other side is a lot of times there is no just yes or no, right? And so when it comes to political issues, And I'll just throw a hot topic out there that we can kind of chew on a little bit. But one of them is border security, right? Immigration, illegal immigration, whatever. And again, you can look at both political parties and find good in their ideal. And it may be flawed, but there is a good and a value in that position. But we don't really want to give it any merit at all, right? So the idea of, like say the left with the open borders and letting people come in, and then the right is saying, no, we need to secure the borders and not allow, so many people in. If the other government is corrupt and they're hurting their people and, they're trying to seek relief from their government and the poverty, and so we want to aid them, or welfare where, somebody's in poverty and we want to give them financial aid or whatnot. There is a Christian ethic to it, right? That we want to help those that are underserved, underprivileged, and being harassed by their government. But then again, we can't say yes to everybody, right? And so there is a complicated aspect to. Again, we're not a theocracy. We're not a Christian nation in that sense, right? So as a Christian, when it comes to, because I've heard missionary, I know I'm rambling, but it's because I didn't really have a clear thought. But I've heard people that are mission-minded or whatever really push back against government or nations having boundaries because we're Christian. We should accept everybody in, right? And so when we say no, that seems unchristian or uncaring or incompassionate.
I think the first and foremost, the most important thing that when you approach a very hot topic like border security and immigration, things like that, it is a political matter. But I think it's important to just say, let's just erase let's just step back and erase the sides for a second. Like if you could just not pin, oh, that's right and that's left. Like just erase those terms for a second. And just go, let's take an analogy and try to approach it as best as we can. And what would the Bible have to say about that, ethically speaking? So I have a home, and I do have a home, and I have borders on my home. Like it's a ranch, and I've got to make sure that there's certain.
Your house isn't a ranch.
No, it's not a ranch. It's not. But but I do have walls, right? And so let's just take my house, and I have walls to my house, and somebody comes knocking on my door. And they insist that I let them in, right? So would you feel violated if the person forced themselves in? I think everybody on the planet would say, well, yeah, that I would feel violated if they didn't have a right. I hadn't given them access or entry on purpose. We'd call that breaking and entering. Right, without permission. Now, say somebody comes up to you and is like, hey, I would like to come in, I would like to work in your house. And you've put out an employment thing like, hey, I need help. And they've come to answer that. Yeah, you'd let them in on a work situation. And if they didn't leave when they needed to leave, you'd be like, dude, you're beyond your time. These kind of small little analogies of thinking about how you would run your house will help you begin to start thinking through ethical situations. Somebody knocks on your door and they're screaming and crying because
someone's going to murder them or something.
Somebody's been chasing them to kill them. Yeah, you're going to let them in your house. I don't care who they are.
At least until you can resolve what happened.
Right. And then when it's resolved, they can go home.
If that's safe for them.
And that's really what the status like a refugee or something is.
But you got to know. You can't just say,
right.
The police can't show up at your door and go, we don't know who this person is. They have to live in your house.
Yeah.
That would be weird. So there's a lot of things. And then what is ultimately good for the person? What is good for the people living in the home? And also when you're in a home, you're protecting the innocent people. You have children. What's good for the children on both sides of the border? I mean, these are all going back. What is the best good that you could do given that human beings can do this, given their resources? But also, I just like to make the distinction. We're having this conversation separate from what I think the church. So we're asking what our government should do that would bring about the best outcome for humans, which is different than what do I think I should do, or what I think the church should do, or what I think other institutions should do or are capable of doing. It's good to keep that distinction in mind as well, because I do think that the church is called to help people differently than perhaps an individual family would.
Erase the sides, right?
Yeah.
You don't live in a house by yourself or with your family, but we both live in the house, and so us three live in the house. Steven's a Christian. Brent is just, dude living in the house, and I'm just dude living in the house. Doesn't matter what our philosophies
Steven's
are.
the only Christian in
Yeah, hold on, watch. Because then you and we both are like, hey, dude, like some guy comes up to our door and he's just like, I just need a place to sleep and stay. And we're like, yeah, come on in. We let him live in the house, and he's eating our food, and he's eating Steven's food, and okay, now he's a Christian though. We've allowed him in the house. He's not leaving because two of us in the home have said, yeah, come on in. How, as a Christian, would I respond in that scenario? Now you're getting a little closer with how the church could or could not respond in this. What has Christ called us to do when we have someone in front of us that's in a situation that they're living in our house, or they're living in our nation in this case? I think there is a responsibility to go like, okay, well, how can I really care for you? Are there skills that I need to do to help you so you can get up on your own 2 feet and go live, or help pay rent, help us get what's going on here, get your own food, or, become part of the family, or maybe get yourself to where you can actually be able to go home and effectively continue to live well there. These are all matters of like, who do you have at your church? What are the gifts going on there? What is the calling? What would you,
number one would just be like, can I persuade this person that Jesus is the best way to live your life? Because that'll solve a lot of problems. Mm-hmm. So to me, like even in that scenario, it would depend on, is this person safe? Is this person going to harm me? Because there is some idea that's hard to witness to someone when they're trying to stab you. So if the person was just a normal person who thought it was right to come in and they had a right and we could have an exchange of ideas, I think it'd be perfectly within my right to have questions with that person. What are you doing here? Why are you here? But ultimately, as a Christian, I would hope I would have that conversation with that person about the gospel at some point. Because if I can persuade him towards that's the best form of living, then a lot of the problems might fix themselves. I've seen this a lot with some churches tack on immigration, in the sense that they believe that preaching the gospel was more important than trying to figure out whether they're here illegally or not. So like, I can't witness to you until I find out your citizenship. So once I preach the gospel, again, we're going to get around to, should you obey God by the rule of law? And is that the best decisions? Have you made the best decisions? Or can I make you legal? And so these are the ethical situations churches wrestle with. And it's different than what I would do if you came to my house. And I think that has to do with safety. It has to do with the people that I'm in charge of protecting. So these things are all laid out. I don't
necessarily think that's different as a church, because there's we
wrestle with that as well.
We fingerprint people. We don't want to let, if there's somebody who has a proclivity towards children, they're not going to be engaged in things. If they've had violence in their past and they've got mental issues, we're going to keep monitor on them because, hey, we don't want a shooting. Just kind of stuff like that is going to be a part of what we do. So my point is, like, you got to take people on a case-by-case basis. And yet we do know, regardless of how they became my neighbor, I'm supposed to love my neighbor.
Right.
Now, does that mean I give them everything they want? Again, I think that is more of a question of what did the scriptures mean by that? And how, and obviously gospel number one, along with meeting immediate, direct, dangerous needs so that they can be productive humans in society doing what they've been called as God to do. So.
The other concern I have, though, is you have to be a truth seeker in these regards. A lot of times people on one side or the other, they want to like take the group of people that is very complex and diverse and make them all one person so that they can get rid of the problem real easy. And this is my problem with a lot of these conversations is we need to know the truth, and we need to be respectful and wanting to navigate what's best for people to do by knowing what the good and the true is. So if I don't know who's coming across my border, I don't know their intent. That's a problem. It's not just a problem for Americans. It's a problem for the little children that are being trafficked across the border that we do know that happens. So again, I care about them. I don't just care about me. So like this is why this becomes complicated, because I do think that one thing you don't want to do is not know what's happening and not know what's true. And I think if you really want to know who's a refugee and who's not a refugee, those are all wonderful questions. We can't just throw all of that caution to the wind because it's gotten so bad. So just in that idea of just being, having that conversation, knowing what the truth is the best way to navigate it, and loving everybody involved to the best of our abilities by what's best for them to do is really the best way to navigate. And you have to make that case, and you have to have people push back, but you have to persuade people. But if you just pick one side and then mischaracterize the other side, and it's just a weird way to kind of cheat, I think, about using the power to get people to do what you want by lying about the facts. So.
The one thing I do want to point out to our listening audience is when I bring up questions like this, it doesn't mean I hold that position.
Yeah.
I feel like it's kind of my job to kind of bring it out so that we can discuss the different things. Because I know that some people think I'm a Calvinist when we were talking about that. And
I also think that if you have a question about what our church wants to do in a particular situation, I'd rather answer that with you.
Yeah.
And so to me, you can ask me what I think we should do as an outreach, and I will answer those questions, but it may be different than what's going on in the nation or whatever, because I feel like our church is supposed to love our neighbors. So.
Do you think a church can both advocate to close a border and yet still care for every single immigrant?
Definitely do. Yeah, I can care for this guy and do what's best for him and care for his needs and still vote, what I think is right for everyone else. So
yeah, and I do think that a lot of people feel like if you're a Christian, then you just need to empty your coffers to help people.
Yeah,
and I will say too, just taking the household imagery too. It's like my family, caring for my family and providing for my family comes first. Then and then I can help others as well. It's not like I'm going to help others and then my family is starving and in need, So again, when it does come to helping, it does. There are limitations of how much you can do.
Yeah, I mean, we both work with the people who have needs in the church. You work with some of the benevolent stuff, and I work with outreach needs. And what people don't realize is often the most harshest criticism comes from those that aren't really helping those people. You haven't worked with those populations. You don't know the intricacies of the details of what's going on, and realize that we both give out care, but we also have to care for other people besides the one. So if the one guy takes all of the resources, I can't help anyone else. And so the idea becomes, what's the greatest good I can possibly do, because I only have limited resources. And so even people think, oh, this is a harsh no. No, this is a yes to someone else who may have a greater need. And so the idea that you think you automatically know, and I just feel like the church has always got a bad rap. I think the church does more for community and for the poor than people give them credit for. They don't see the intricacies of how, even in town, most people in town working with the poverty situation, most of them are working in tandem with the church in some way. And all of them are there, and all of them are on the front lines of the issue. But for some reason, I don't know, we don't necessarily need credit, but the idea is that we're there, and people often say, well, you guys don't even care. And I'm like, that's not the saying. That's not the best. We are looking at what's the best that we can do, even with our own limited resources.
And to be quite honest, unlike a lot of secular organizations, churches don't run around tooting their horn.
No.
Because it doesn't feel that there's an attempt to be humble in the midst of doing good. Not, we'd rather people discover it and see that we weren't looking to be famous and amazing, but just to literally just do good, because good is what we should be doing.
If you want anything, come to a church. You'll find someone who used to be a drug addict. You'll find someone that used to do something that you just thought, oh my gosh, that person did what? It's most of the time you're going to find someone's life been changed sitting in the pew. And so that's why I tell people, like, if you think coming to church is about being good, you've missed the whole point of why we're there. All of us are not good, and that's why we're hanging out here, is because we know that. And so, but we do get that rap.
Right. So there's some other questions that are out there, and especially on Christians and political engagement. I want to point to a very, very good handbook that has been produced just this year by the ERC, ERLC, which is the basically the arm of the ethics and it's the Ethics and Religious Liberty Commission from the Southern Baptists. And they produced like a catechism for political engagement for Christians, and it's shaped around questions like what is politics, and then was Paul's attitude towards government? What's natural law, and why is it important to Christian political thought? What's the purpose of the government? Should the state promote a formal religion or denomination? And you'll be shocked how some of these things are answered. Is political participation a form of worldly compromise? Do I have an obligation to vote? Is civil disobedience ever justified? So ERLC.
LC.com.
Right? Yeah, and it is very, very good. It's a PDF. It's big. It's 98 pages, but it's got every question you could probably think of and a nice 1.5 page answer to every single one of them. And
yeah, there's a lot here.
So it's a really, really cool. I endorse it just as a very, very good piece of literature for everybody out there who's curious on how you might answer some of these questions. And so it even talks about political triage, how you should understand your voting, and what are the things you should put in front of other things when it comes to your vote. And it's just a very, very helpful document.
Have either of you guys ever read Wayne Grudem's book, Politics?
Yeah, I have.
Yeah?
I've heard of it. I haven't read through it. I've seen sections of
it. It has, there have been some accusations that it's a little overly partisan and wasn't as kind of neutral as people would expect from like a theological position. But I think he does a good job drawing out the important aspects of why we put it's a little dated at this point. It was from way back in he was arguing why Christians should vote for Mitt Romney, even though he's a Mormon. It's an older book, but
well, Mitt Romney, that's not as old as I was thinking when you said that.
It's just the same people run all the time. That's why.
Yeah. Oh, that's right. Here we go again.
So we got a question. Unless if you're ready to move forward. So this one comes from Nate, and since last week's sermon was on good works, I'm guessing that's where this question came from. So, what kind of good works draw people in? So, it's probably the idea that as we do good works, people take notice, and it points to God and glorifies God. People have different views on good works. For example, some people think that abortion is a good work. So again, what kind of good works draw people in? And why is it that the younger generation fights against God? So I will say, I'll take that one. That one's the easy one. This younger generation fights against God. Number one, if you go to Genesis chapter 3, you will see that they fought against God.
Lots of generations.
Chapter 4 with Cain and Abel, they fought against God. So this is nothing new, and every generation feels like the new generation has abandoned all of the morals and ethos of the culture, and
I was actually on.
We are hopeless.
I was actually on Barna. And looking, Barna's a research website. They do polling of churches and church members, and they're asking do you think the next generation is generous? And of course, the older you get, the more they're we're doomed. Yeah. That next generation's never going to do it. And the younger generation's yeah, we're really looking forward to giving. We love giving. And it's that's so funny.
And I mean, this new generation is very, we went through the whole, justice, what is that? Social justice movements, where everybody's trying to do good works. So I will say, why is it fighting against God? I think probably the biggest reason, other than the fact that mankind has always fought against God. This is nothing new. But we have become more and more an atheistic country. So we've removed God from the schools. We've removed God from the public square as much as we can. And so
I wouldn't say
more of it comes, I think, from ignorance. And
I wouldn't know. I don't know if we'd say atheistic as much as I think we would think of ourselves. It's become far more deistic. Oh yeah, there's a God out there. He just doesn't bug me. It's that's kind of the general consensus of Americans is that there's a God. We're not atheistic. It's just he's not that important.
I wonder what the percentage is really of people that believe that there is a God.
It's still pretty high.
It's pretty high?
Yeah, it's still pretty high.
I mean, it used to be 80% would say, people identified themselves as Christians. And I would say, even though they probably weren't living out a Christian life, that basically would say that they believed in God. I would say it's probably 50% or lower now. My gut reaction would be, do you guys have any real data on that?
It's according to a survey conducted in 2003, 74% of Americans in the United States say that they believed in God.
Wow. Okay. 74%. Wow.
Gallup has it at 81%, which is a new low.
So 74% of the nation believe in God. So that would mean many of those are fighting against God. The other people just don't believe he exists. So you're not fighting against somebody that doesn't exist, right? So, but going on, what kind of good works draw people in? And people have different views of what good works are. So what are good works?
Yeah, I mean, you're talking a lot about good works. Again, the word good comes up a lot, right? Who defines what's good? And I think for us as a Christian, what defines what is good for us is the Word of God himself, and the Word of God gives us lots of instructions on that. And so oftentimes doing good works means to live a life that would bring glory and honor to God by reflecting his character. And so that has a lot to do with everything from stewardship, how you raise your family, how you care for your people, how you work, how you treat other people. And the big one, though, and I think this will come up maybe more next week, is this idea of suffering. The idea that Christ suffered to show that what he believed was true is really a big part of how Christians are going to show that what they believe is true, because it says that you're willing to give up the thing that other people would never give up, because if you don't believe there's an afterlife, why would you give up your life? And so the idea would be, who would give up their life if they didn't believe that there was an afterlife? And so the idea that the more you sacrifice, you pursue something, and people see that, it draws those people out. And if you're willing to do that because you actually believe there's a court of heaven, that God rewards those who diligently seek him and do his will, then I think those are the greatest work. So what would that look like? Well, it depends on where God's placed you, what resources that he's blessed you with, what are the things that you can do with your hands that bring a glory to him by working hard. So these are all verses that you see in the Bible that talk about doing good works.
I think, though, again, one of the interesting pieces, whenever you see the word good and then you see the word works combined together, I didn't get into this, but Peter's using a very specific word for good, and it's the word that is used in Genesis chapter 1 over and over and over to define tov, which is and usually you want to take the earliest definition given on what its context is as kind of the meditative seed, that piece that you're going to keep bringing into the text every time you go there. And so here you have God forming and filling. And it's good, it's good, it's good. Then he makes humanity in his image to do what? To go fill the earth and go be protected and be fruitful. And so I really think that the reference to good works is one, that making those cultural goods, being excellent at producing and doing these things. And then there's the Jesus section of love your neighbor as yourself, serve and give your life away to someone else. How do you lead? How do you be a first place person amongst the nations? By being the servant of all. And so there's this sense of you're going to be great in the kingdom of God when you give your life away in service. And so, that's why if you're going to be a nurse, you're willing to do hard things and take some of the hardest cases to care for people. You're willing, and it may cause you suffering, but you're willing to do it. And these are the kind of things that people go like, why are you doing this? And it's because I've been given eternal. It opens the door to say, because I've been given eternal life. Like, I really do believe that if I lose my life, I still have gained it. That this is not all there is. I'm willing to do this very good thing. And I think most things that are, let me put it this way, I think we do a lot of good, but I think we do a lot of convenient good as Americans. We're very
the access so that I already have.
Yeah, we're very good at doing convenient good, but when it's a sacrificial good, when it's going to really cost you something because you believe in Jesus, man, it's that is a different thing. That makes people lean in. Somebody's going to go to another country to preach Jesus and leave America. They're like, why in the world
you're
would
leaving
you
one
go?
comfort for something that seems like suffering
unnecessarily. That's why it's easy to support people than it is to be the people, right? It's easier to write a check for something that you consider good than it is to actually engage and be part of it and put in your blood, sweat, and tears on that. But
I mean, I'll give another example because there's a secondary side to this. There is also the good works of protecting that we see, that he says protect the garden. One of the things that we're doing at Olive Branch and connecting with as a church is several families are trying to protect. We're trying to engage the Corona-Norco Unified School District to tell them, hey guys, you have some very seriously bad literature being presented to children that will cause harm, whether you think it will or not. You can't remove what you expose somebody to, and we're not just trying to speak it as Christians. I mean, we're trying to bring Muslims and Jehovah's Witnesses, like all kinds of morally inclined people, to say, yeah, we don't want our children exposed to these kinds of things. Now, that sounds like, oh my gosh, people aren't going to lean in on that. But if we have to like really wrestle and struggle through this in a way of like, but stay honorable and caring and loving in the midst of it, that looks radically different. And so it's keeping away the vitriol, it's the attitude as you do protective work. That's powerful. I think a lot of people lean into Martin Luther King Jr. because his attitude
and the sacrifice
combined in his protest. I mean, there's a situation of protest, of protection, of fighting for something good that wasn't done in a wrong manner, and I think it had a great effect. In this case, like my argument there is again to say, people go, oh, you're banning a book, and we're like, we're not. A book ban would be that we're trying to go to the publisher and say these kinds of books should never be published in the United States. That would be a book ban. That'd be censorship. We're saying, you want to buy that book for your kid? Buy that book for your kid. But we don't think that the general good of a people, of a public sphere, should involve this book. It's already been argued that as we can't offer books like that to each other without being considered sexual harassment. Like that would be inappropriate. In the business world, it would be inappropriate. In the nonprofit world, but it's appropriate in an educational classroom. That doesn't make sense, especially with children, and where
you can't process it like an adult.
I mean, a lot of the discussions they have, and a lot of the things they talk about, it's grooming language, and it would be illegal,
right?
In many settings.
And I don't want to use terms like that because I don't think anybody's intentionally trying to sexually harass or intentionally trying to groom. I don't think that as a sexualized culture, we even know what that looks like anymore. Pornography has groomed everybody already. You can't. I mean, the fact that they're taking movies and old shows and they're infusing them with sexuality because they want to reach a sexualized culture is like that. That's just proof that we've just continually overwrought ourselves with sexuality. But that doesn't mean that that's a good thing. That we shouldn't draw the appropriate line, especially in a community filled with religious people who don't want that kind of thing happening.
I think it's better to, instead of using grooming, is to actually talk about what the damage would be. And when you introduce inappropriate materials or harsh physical, especially some of the things that in other school districts have been physical things, it can impede their development in ways that we have good data to prove. And so to me, it's like being even more specific might be even better by saying like this will harm their development. It affects their relationships with other people. It makes them have a hard time understanding their own development.
Well, not to mention, I just believe that to violate a child's conscience, when he tells you or they tell you, I don't feel comfortable reading this, is, I mean, and I'm not even, there's people who may say that about the Bible. I'm like, that's fine. In that sense, let the Bible be read in their home, let the Bible be read at their church, let the Bible be read in a context where, but if it's in a public sphere where somebody feels violated, they got to read the Bible because they're Muslim or they're Jewish or the New Testament anyway, then okay, that's that. I'm not here to shove one viewpoint down. I'm legitimately saying there needs to be a common viewpoint. And so that the kind of stuff is the way you have to think through your argument, think through how you're going to approach what you're seeing as the good to make the argument for the good. And when you're having to do those kinds of goods, it's how you approach it. And it's the carefulness in how you approach it. It's not it's vitriol. It's it's going to be receiving all of the comments on this, and just kind of going, okay, well, that's where life is. So,
yeah, and then part of that too is what kind of good works draw people in. I think I don't think it's limited to, but I think it really can be codified in two views. I mean, number one, you look at Romans chapter 1 verse 18 through the end of the chapter, and it's just talking about the degradation of mankind. They've exchanged truth for a lie. They don't give God the honor he deserves, and he's turned them over, and they've exchanged the truth for a lie. So part of it is in this culture too, like you were talking about the abortion issue. Some people may not see a good work as a good work because they hold a different view. They have exchanged truth for a lie. So I would say, though, the way it draws people in is twofold. Number one, either they agree with you that this is a good work and they're like, oh, or two, even if they don't agree necessarily that it is a truly good work, that there was a sacrifice on your part that was not self-serving. And so even though they may not fully like, well, that's a good work, it draws them in on a curiosity level. Like, why would somebody sacrifice to this degree and not benefit from it, And so I think that at least that turns on that curiosity switch, which would draw them in. So I do think it's part of it is you guys are on the same page, so they acknowledge it as a good work and it draws them in. Or from a curiosity standpoint, it draws them in to explore it a little more.
Yeah, as William Dembski said in his book, The End of Christianity, he said the currency of love in a fallen world is suffering.
Suffering, yeah.
But it's suffering not just to suffer; it's suffering for the good of the other that you say you love.
Was that Dembski? I thought that was Tim Keller, but I read it in a Tim Keller book. I read it in the Ministries of Mercy, I think.
Nothing, again, we'll go back to the original conversation, as a church or as an individual, because I find that the best ways that draw people and the best good works are the ones you do for the ones that are placed in your life. So like the idea is like your neighbor, your friend, that you go above and beyond for that person is probably going to bring them in more than if I did a program per se. Maybe God would bless the program, but even if he does, it'll be because the individuals partook in that in that sense. Like,
and we all know the best quote programs are born typically out of somebody who started caring for one person at a time. They didn't just whip up some kind of business or kind of ministry and just go, we whipped this ministry up and now we're helping. No, somewhere back there you were helping somebody and that started to grow.
Yeah, I just think about my own life when someone actually did a good thing for me at their own, to the damage of their own self. They didn't have to. That had the most impact on me, and I still feel like that's the way it works for other people. It's like, but it's just about making myself aware of those opportunities that is the hardest thing, because I'm singularly focused on my own life, and you don't want to give above and beyond sometimes because you're worried about your own comfort. And so to me, the greatest impact is when people can clearly see you didn't have to do that, and you totally did, and it doesn't make any sense why you would do that for me. I haven't even been a good neighbor or haven't even been a good friend. That's what I've seen other people in our church do well, is when they're just like, that's crazy. Why would you do that? Because I don't have to worry about me getting mine because I got everything I need. That's what I think has the most impact.
Well, there's a lot more we could go on and on and on about.
Just out of curiosity, was this a question written by an adult?
Yeah, no, it was written by a kid, but he's now an adult.
No, but was it written 18? When he was a kid or when he was an adult?
When he was a kid.
Wow.
What a question.
Right. Awesome.
Seemed a real smart adult.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's
Nate.
Well, we're glad you guys joined us, and we hope that this has been enlightening to you as it has for me. I've learned a lot sitting here and talking about this stuff, but hopefully you guys have had a wonderful time listening, having a good time, listening, whatever. But we're just glad you're with us or watching, right? And so if you got any questions, please feel free to let us know. obcc.church. That's that's not that one. That's the ending. Rabbit Trail at obcc.church. We'll figure this out later. Rabbit Trail at obcc.church. We're just, we're out of steam. I'm out of steam. So we're just glad you joined us. And we pray that you have not given up on this point. So God bless you. Have a great week.
Happy birthday, Nate. Boom chakalaka.
Happy birthday, everybody.
Bye.